So I get the joy of introducing Wael Elasady, and I'm pleased to welcome him. Wael is a Palestinian born in Syria. His grandparents were forced to leave their homes in Sept in the northeast of Palestine in 1948. He immigrated to the United States with his family in 1987. He is a longtime Palestinian human rights and social justice activist from Portland, Oregon. And I've known him for many, many years and very much value his prophetic voice as he speaks about Palestinian struggles for human rights, those rights that his family lost. Please welcome Wael Elasady.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And I wanted to start by thanking Catherine in particular for always inviting me back to speak at these events, and also for doing, I think, something really important for me personally, which is encouraging me. I've been speaking about Palestine for years and years. And I've always really kind of taken more of an analytical approach to presenting what's happening in Palestine, you know, facts, figures, but didn't really talk too much about how I was personally affected, and really what my family went through, and which was obviously how I got into, you know, thinking about Palestine in the first place. And so Catherine kind of helped encourage me, you know, to talk about that, and I did that at the church. I think like a year ago now, since we've had our long march that's lasted what feels like 5 years. So I really appreciate that, and it's really important for me to kind of help remember my grandmother who's in Syria right now. You know, when I was growing up, I really learned about Palestine and learned that I was Palestinian. You know, we were born in Syria, but I learned that I was Palestinian from my grandmother and grandfather, who would, you know, sit me and my sister down and talk about what it was like to be forced out of Palestine. My grandmother's father was actually both a school teacher and a poet, and he had written a book of poetry about the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe, and the forced removal from him and the family's homes in Sept. And you know, my grandmother would read the poetry, and then always my grandfather, they would switch, and then my grandfather would pick up the book of poetry, and he tended to be a lot more emotional, so he'd be able to read maybe one or two of the poems before he'd break down crying. But that was really my first introduction, and they told me their story, which was you know, really difficult, obviously. You know, both sets of my grandparents, actually, I'm talking about my mother's side, who I was very close with and lived with, but both sets of my grandparents were from Palestine and Sept, which, if people aren't familiar with Sept, for a group like this, I would say the best thing you could know about it, it's about a 20-minute drive just north of the Lake of Galilee. You could literally, Sept is up in the mountains, and you can, you know, from going back and visiting it, but also for my grandfather's descriptions, you can really, you could see the Sea of Galilee from the town of Sept. And they, when they were forced out in 1948, my grandmother was really young, so she was a 13-year-old. You know, at that time, Haganah militias which were the Israeli militias at the time, had come, and there was a big siege of the city of Sept, and the whole town was ultimately, the resistance there to the expulsion was defeated, and the whole town was eventually forced out. And there's, you know, heartbreaking stories of some of the real difficulties. My grandmother says there was one night, as one of the things that was used to kind of stoke fear in the hearts of the Palestinians that were living of what would happen if either A, they resisted, or B, if they stayed, was that there was a town just down the road, and you can see it from Safad, that was taken over. And a lot of the homes were demolished and lit on fire. So a lot of the children and the families had sat on their rooftops. And Safad had resisted for a very long time, and was a bigger city, large population. But as soon as they saw that, there was really a lot of fear, and the exodus begins kind of after this, as they're both facing attacks and as they're leaving. And so at that time, my grandmother and her family left on foot and walked to the Lebanese border, and eventually were placed on buses and had to leave fairly quickly. The decision, it was always, she always tells me the story of how it was always, oh, we're not going anywhere. There's no way. There's too many of us. We've been here forever. And then all of a sudden the next day it was clear that there was no option but to leave or stay behind and kind of face the consequences, and people having to leave behind, all of their possessions. And of course, all the stories of people leaving behind, leaving very quickly with food still cooking, or burying their gold and their possessions and hiding it, thinking that we'll be back a week or a few months later, and of course never coming back. That was my grandmother, and my grandfather actually was a little bit older. He was 20 years old, and he was in Egypt at the time, studying at the University of Cairo. But his family was there in Safad, and had also left. And this is one thing that had happened at that time, was there was also a siege of Safad. It was surrounded by the Israeli militias. And so there was actually a big shortage of food in Safad in the weeks leading up to the Exodus. And one of the saddest stories that my grandfather tells is about him hearing, obviously, from the news that Palestine had fallen, that the family had left, and he returned. He takes a flight from Cairo, and his family had ended up in Syria because his grandfather had actually served in the Ottoman military and had some established relationships in Syria. So that's where they ended up. And he takes a flight from Cairo to Lebanon, and then drives over and meets the family in Syria. And what the family hadn't told him was actually both his mother and his sister had died of tuberculosis as part of the exposure and some of the hardships that they experienced of having to leave in the middle of May. It was a particularly bitterly cold May that year, when people were kind of forced out on foot. And so, he dealt with not only losing his mom, his country and his home, but then also losing his mother, and then his sister, who was taking care of his mother as a result. And my family, in a lot of ways, were very lucky. As I said, my grandfather had, we had the connections to be able to live in Syria, and we didn't end up in the refugee camps. They were able to get an apartment and essentially live in Damascus. But the story of my family is like the story of, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948. There was over 750,000 Palestinians who were forced from their homes and made to leave their country. And the stories are different. Safad was really unique. I went back, I've gone back a few times at this point to visit my grandparents' home. In Safad, it's actually very eerie in a way, because all the houses are still there. So when I went back the first time, and I'm able to go back because I have American citizenship. My grandmother, who was born there, lived there, would never, be able to go back to her home because she's Palestinian and doesn't have that ability. But I'm able to go back and, of course, just visit. When I went back, one of the things that really struck me about Safad was it's this beautiful city. It's on top of this mountain, and it has all these beautiful brick buildings and walkways and stone, and the houses are all there intact as they were. So before I went into Palestine, I had gone back to Syria first, and I had met with, this was when my grandfather was alive, it was back in 2008. And I had met with all the older heads of the families, and they had actually all come together and drawn a map from memory of the houses in Safad and written the names of all the different places. Here's the Hajj Isa house, here's the Asadi house, here's this house. And they gave me this detailed map that drawn from their memory of exactly where each home was. And I went on this trip and I found the house based on that. And when I arrived at Safad, Safad was completely erased. All the Palestinians living there were left. So you have cities like Haifa, which are still mixed. There's still some Palestinians that didn't leave. So you have some Israeli Jews, some Palestinians, but in Safad, everybody left, but their homes are still standing, and the Israelis moved right into their homes. So when I went back, I found the house and I knocked on the door, and I found a lady who had moved there in 1967, actually, in my grandmother's house. She was older. I think she was like 95 at the time. She's probably passed since then. She, I was luckily with a person who was a British Iraqi woman, and this woman had immigrated from from Britain in 1967. So they had the same accent, and as a result of that, there was some rapport built, and she, had me tour my grandmother's house. And at the end of the tour had asked, do more of you plan on coming back? And we're like, a lot of us hope so, that we can come back to our country and to our homes. But that's the experience in Safad, a city that has the homes of people still there. I showed my grandmother the pictures that I took, and she started crying when I went back, because not only was the house recognizable, but the actual metal bars on the windows were still the same color. The fig tree that I had heard about growing up was still there. All of these different elements were still there, but no Palestinians were there. And Safad's a particularly religious city for the Jews that live there. So it was very strange. Other places are mixed, and some places, and this is the majority of the villages, were wiped out. In fact, the Israeli government, after forcing the Palestinians out, destroyed about 500 villages in Palestine. Many of them were bulldozed, and parks were built on top of them to essentially erase the memory of the Nakba, or attempt to erase it. So that's my grandparents' story. But like I said, 750,000 people were forced out. And again, in 1967, another 300,000. And those refugees that live in the area now number 5 million around the world, the majority of which are living in the Arab countries in the region or inside places like Gaza. People don't know that all the suffering that Gaza feels from the siege, from the bombardment from the air, and one of the saddest parts is those are majority refugees that live in Gaza who were forced out a first time in 1948 from their homes. And so that's one kind of story of the exile and what, being a refugee. For my family, my parents obviously grew up in Syria. We left Syria in 1987 as the economic and political situation really begins to be difficult, and moved to the United States. We actually came undocumented. My parents were able to get a tourist visa first, and then they came. They wouldn't give me and my sister a tourist visa with a visa to come with my parents, because they knew that with how difficult the situation was in the Middle East, that a lot of people would want to stay and try to get a better life. And so we lived separated for a whole year apart. And my mother had just about given up. We had been trying to get a visa every single month and was like, I'm going back. I can't take anymore. I can't be apart from my kids. And finally, you were able to apply for a visa once a month. And finally, we'd go with my grandfather, and on that last stride before my mom was like, no more, we were lucky enough to get the visa and were able to come out, and then lived undocumented in this country for a lot of years. That experience just kind of makes me think, it's like we were lucky to be home with our grandparents, but that separation was so difficult. And I think about, kids who are living, in detention centers today, who are separated from their parents, in this country, who've tried to immigrate. And you can really see, some of the connections there. And I think for me, it was, in a lot of ways, I grew up as, a normal, if you will, Arab American kid. Until I didn't really, when I was younger, I didn't feel like I felt a lot of racism. And I felt, I got weird looks for having pita bread and hummus when I'd go to, to school with my lunch. And people were like, what is that? Which, as a kid was like a little uncomfortable, but that was the extent of it. But then, 9/11 happened. And a lot of that racism against Palestinians, against Arabs, against Muslims really, really increases. And that's really kind of when I begin to start thinking about Palestine more, and thinking back to my grandparents' stories and their experiences. And eventually, through this process of self-exploration, I end up going back, as I said, to Palestine in 2008. I do a summer camp there with other international students. And I see firsthand what, not only a history, right? What happened to the Palestinians is not a one-off event that happened in 1948, but is something that obviously continues to this day, and that I witnessed there. Whether there's different levels of oppression for Palestinians. There's the millions of refugees who are still in neighboring countries without citizenship, without a homeland, without rights. There's the Palestinians who were able to stay behind, unlike my grandparents who weren't forced out, but who stayed behind. They now have citizenship in Israel, and there's about 1.6 million of them. They make up actually 20% of the Israeli population, but they live as second-class citizens. They're not allowed to purchase homes and live in particular areas in supposedly the country that they're from, that they have citizenship and rights to, but they're unable to purchase homes. They can't expand their own villages. The zoning laws won't allow them to make cities like Nazareth any bigger, which is inside Israel. To the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, who face a different kind of oppression, and of course live under a military occupation. And if people have seen, I'll share real quick the screen here. But I'm sure people have seen some of the maps of Palestine. But as people can see over time, what has happened is a colonization of Palestine by Israelis, by Jewish Israelis who've come and kind of replaced the population. You can see these changes here of migration, inward migration of Jewish immigrants, and outward of Palestinians who were kicked out. 750,000 in Nakba, another 400,000 in 1967. And then the people who've been internally displaced and who today, there are Bedouin communities which find themselves one day with Israeli citizenship, and then all of a sudden the next day they go to try to do some paperwork, and they find out they're not citizens anymore all of a sudden. So the Israeli state is able to strip them of their citizenship. Or if you're a Palestinian who lives in Jerusalem, And if you dare to leave to visit your relatives in Jordan or to visit relatives elsewhere, you come back and you find yourself stripped of your residency inside of Jerusalem, and your home potentially destroyed, and settlers moving into the area that you're living in. So, the experience in the West Bank is obviously particularly horrible, whether you talk about the apartheid wall that takes, that surrounds a lot of Palestinian families, cuts off their resources to water, or whether you talk about things like major economic inequality. People, that's a part that's not even talked about, because there's so many different elements, like checkpoints that are horrendous, like, lack of access to drinking water, taking over Palestinians' natural resources. But in a way, this is a number to look at. The per capita income for Israelis is $37,000 a year. The per capita for Palestinians living right there under the control of the Israeli military is $4,978 a year. In the Gaza Strip, it's $1,900 a year. And just a stark difference for people living in the same region. You can have a settlement with green grass, pools, access to the best healthcare resources and jobs, and right next door, down in the valley, you have a Palestinian village that is surrounded by checkpoints, that is surrounded by an apartheid wall, and who are being deprived of access to any kind of income. And I'll share this link because this is really great. I don't have time to go through all of these, but this is such a nice way to kind of understand what Palestinians face today. It's called Visualizing Palestine 101, and it has wonderful infographics and maps about some of the current experiences of Palestinians. And then, of course, there are the Palestinians in Gaza today who face really indescribable and inhumane situation. The United Nations said that Gaza is going to become uninhabitable by 2020. Well, it's there. The life expectancy, of course, of the Palestinians in Gaza is dropping. The amount of malnutrition that kids in Gaza experience is unbelievable due to a siege that doesn't allow basic necessities to come in. And so one way to kind of understand all of these different forms of oppression that Palestinians face is a prison system. Sometimes the Israeli state will loosen things up if the Palestinians in the West Bank are acting good, and if they're, if they're not making too much trouble and really being okay with being occupied and not being given resources. But if they ever step it up, they have mechanisms to really be able and go in and strangle the population and make them, come to heel. And different Palestinians, as you can see, face this oppression in different ways. Whether you're a refugee who is never able to return to their home, whether you're a Palestinian in the West Bank who can't get to your aunt's or your parents' house that should be a half-hour drive, but it turns into a 4-hour ordeal and potentially a confrontation with an Israeli soldier because of all the checkpoints and all the control of movement, or whether you're a Palestinian in the Gaza Strip who literally is from day to day trying to figure out how to just simply survive. And I don't, I obviously don't like to stop there, but I make that point just to say that the what Palestinians face, the ethnic cleansing, is something that has gone on from 1948 and that continues to this very day. And really what we're seeing today is even an acceleration of that process. With Trump's deal of the century, so-called, that he attempted to put in place, that people have heard of, which I think a lot of Palestinians and people who understand what's happening call the steal of the century, because what it really is has nothing to do with peace. It's rather an attempt to simply try to codify the existing apartheid, some of these things that I was talking about, and say, here, either live with this and live with Israeli control, or if you don't, we'll just annex everything and take it ourselves and make unilateral decisions. It was a deal that was done without even one Palestinian participating in it. And it's an attempt to essentially justify and make people attempt to forget about international law, about all the violations that Israel is doing, just as, you know, the Trump administration has so-called you know, done a peace deal with the countries of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Israel. These are countries that were never at war with Israel in the first place. But what this is really about is to essentially hide the fact of the human rights violations of the Palestinians and to normalize what's happening, to normalize the fact that Israel wants to annex this land, that it wants to continue with the expropriation and exploitation of the Palestinians. And that's the bad side of things, that things in a lot of ways, I would have to say that for Palestinians on the ground, you know, I was just there this last, not this summer, last summer, and it was very sad. I had gone in 2008, and there was still a lot of resistance happening in 2008. There was still a sense of optimism, even though people had gone through a tremendous amount of suffering and years of occupation. But I think the Palestinians, there was a sense of, we are really in a difficult situation. And my understanding is COVID has made things even more difficult, obviously, for the Palestinians, and Israel's really taken advantage of that to increase its annexations at this time, as well as detaining children and its various violations. So the situation in some ways on the ground is worse for Palestinians than it has been since 1948, since the Nakba. They're in a really difficult spot. But there are signs of hope, and I think that's where our role comes in. And I'll end on this, because I think it's very important what we do here in the United States. The U.S. is obviously the largest, as we can see, military financial backer of the state of Israel, but it's also morally and politically protects the state through its violation of human rights of the Palestinians on the political level, and now is encouraging. And I think to a certain extent, we're beginning to see really the true face. It's become more apparent, even though it's always existed, that what at the core of it is racism and supremacy against another people. And I think that's why there's such, they're buddies with the Trump administration, because there is an element of that, of them finding common ground on these kind of issues. But what is happening, despite what some of these governments are doing, and what leaders are doing, there is, I think, here in the United States, a real turning of the tide. There are more and more people who I think are coming to the conclusion that what the state of Israel is doing to the Palestinians is unacceptable. I think at the same time that we're making strides, thanks to the movement for Black lives in this country, to say that racism continues and is unacceptable. I think the generation that is challenging sexism, the generation that is really, in this country, beginning to see that you have to fight oppression and inequality in all its forms, I think also is recognizing today that you cannot, oppress you cannot be for the state of Israel and be against oppression and against inequality. It doesn't mesh. And so I think we're seeing huge strides, whether it's the growth of JVP, whether it's Christian congregations that are beginning to take up the issue, or whether it's even congressional, progressive and social democratic congressional leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like Rashida Tlaib, like Bernie Sanders, who have finally, we begin to see some of these issues coming up at the national level for the first time. And I think people are beginning to realize that there is a possibility and the need to end support for Israel's human rights violations. And I think our role here is, I think I've been kind of out of circulation with the day-to-day activism, being a new father, but I know there's a lot of amazing stuff happening around the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement still, and that plays a very important role in divesting from companies. There's obviously still a huge role to play in terms of education on this question, and today more and more, I think the reason that there's a need for us to even look to kind of raise our sights a little bit, because for the first time we begin to see things like bills being passed into, not passed, but at least introduced into the halls of Congress that say aid to Israel needs to be conditioned on their ending their human rights violations for Palestine. And I think for many of us who've been in this work for a long time, that would have been unthinkable that we can have these conversations at that level. And I think it's really a time to push. It's a time to talk about Palestine and talk about it in the context of all of these other beautiful movements and struggles. We're facing ecological catastrophe in this world. That's not disconnected from, a world in which Palestinians can be oppressed, because it's about people being able to make decisions about their everyday. It's about democracy. It's about human rights. And I think Palestine has to be part of that conversation and an essential part of it. So I'll stop there to make sure there's enough time for questions and discussion.
Okay.
Okay, Jean?
I'm Jean, yeah. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate that you shared from the emotional side as well as the, the data and everything. The Central Pacific Conference, I don't know if you're aware of this, but besides having our support for Palestinian human rights, we also, through our wider church ministries team, support human rights in the Philippines. And there's an organization called ICHIRP, which is International Committee on Palestinian, right, on Philippine human rights. And it seems to me that there could be some real value in, exploring this intersectionality between the situation in Palestine and the situation in the Philippines. The oppression is oppression in many ways. And there is a bill right now in Congress to try to stop US military aid to the Duterte regime in the Philippines. And so I was just curious to know if you have any knowledge about that situation or any connections in that arena.
Okay, well, maybe I'll answer that one, and then people some time to.
I wrote my question in the chat box. It's Maria Corey saying, I used to read about the Holocaust growing up as a Greek child in America at public school. So at the end, I wonder if everyone can just say, why can't we read about this in 10th grade?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Great question.
it should be part of I think it's a good idea to have it be part of the studies in high school.
Oh. Yeah.
So Wael, you should know that, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 of us are on the Palestine team. So that's one of the reasons you're not getting major questions. So
You're right. Okay.
wondering about Raylene? There you are. Do you have she's muted.
You're muted, Raylene. Unmute. There you go.
Most people enjoy me being muted. I worked in as an instructional assistant and as an office administrator in a public charter school, and they taught a lot of things that are outside the normal textbooks. But one of the things that I found interesting when you're talking about why don't we learn about these things is that this has just been about 3 or 4 years ago that I was there. was that even the Vietnam War couldn't be discussed in a general public school because it wasn't 50 years in the past. It had to wait 50 years before they could start including it in our Southern United States-based textbooks. So the folks who create the educational platforms for our students have their own agenda as to what's going to be taught and what's not going to be taught. And if it's against the philosophies of the folks that are helping publish those criteria, the curriculum, it's likely not going to hit generic public schools. It's stuff that we need to find ways, whether it's through churches or through youth organizations, we need to help start educating people. The Black Lives Movement probably won't be talked about for a long, long time as far as general population discussions in classrooms, because it is so politicized. So just as a point of reference from being in a school system for a period of time.
Yeah.
So it's not a question, it's just.
As a former historian, some of the reason for that is the sense that until there's been a certain amount of time, you can't, a historian shouldn't responsibly speak about it because there hasn't been enough time to do this study, and there should be another classroom, a current affairs kind of classroom where those things should be discussed.
Mhm.
So, and I think maybe, it was probably when my kids were in middle school and high school, they did talk about everything. I mean, they talked about Palestine, they talked about, they learned about the Vietnam War because I think there's been enough time that the histories are beginning to be, responsible histories are being written about it. But they did encounter a lot of, a variety of views on a lot of hot topic political issues. So that actually gave me a lot of hope. That was here in Hillsborough, so that was hope giving to me.
Well, I just want to say I was born in 1948, so I know that was more than 50 years ago. And so it's legit now. We can put that.
I was too.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that for historians, they like to look back. They don't want to, if it's too close, it feels irresponsible to write about it for a historian. But maybe that's, I'm a church historian, so we think about the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
But I absolutely agree that students should be learning in the classroom about the world and how it's evolving and unfolding.
It's not a popular subject.
Well, one of the things that's happening on the campuses is there's a great move to silence those who bring up the issues of Palestine.
Yes.
And that's, I know the National United Church of Christ Palestine-Israel Network is considering, I can't say they're definitely going to do this, considering a resolution on that, because it's, it's silencing our right to speak about something so devastating about what's going on there now, the apartheid that's there now. So, and we would then be asked to help pass that through our churches if that comes out.
Mhm.
And I believe that they're going to be writing that. They are writing that.
What can you say more about what that resolution will, to whom it will be addressed?
It would go to General Synod once it has passed through a number of churches, just to make it legitimate enough to go to General Synod.
Right, and then to whom will General Synod be speaking when they hopefully pass it?
It'll go back to all the churches instead of just the 5 or whatever it is that have to pass it originally.
I guess what I'm asking is, how do we get the universities to listen to us?
Yes.
That's a question right there. I don't know the answer to that.
No.
I know that when we have passed resolutions before, they went immediately into the news and also in Israel. We passed them and it was an immediate response in Israel. They heard about what we were doing. And that was a divestment resolution the national group brought to General Synod. So it would be all the people who attend General Synod who would take it back to their schools, and those who hear about it in the local church. It's, you know how the polity is, that we are not top down. We share what we come up with.
I'm thinking logically, Jeannie, that it would make sense that it go first and foremost to the historically UCC colleges to be sure that those indeed are, and colleges and seminaries, and be sure that they are not allowing free speech to be quashed. But then beyond that, I would think to the boards of directors of, universities around the country, calling them to authenticity and to live into their own values that they espouse.
Right. But I know one person in Portland has urged me to do something about the school system so that here we are teaching about what happened in 1948 and also that it's continuing. It's not over.
Right.
When is it going to be over so we can teach about it? I'm not sure that ever is going to happen with Palestine. So,
Jeff, did you have something to say?
Jeff?
What's that?
Oh, I wondered if you'd raise your hand. It looked like
No,
you maybe
I'm
did.
just flapping around here. Sorry.
You're flying around?
No, just want to make sure.
Swatting flies.
So.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of jump in on the question, because I think that the question of how do we take it up in schools is it's a real fight there. I mean, think about even what's happening right now with the attacks by the Trump administration to attempt to essentially make illegal critical race theory teaching at the level, right? And I mean, so there is a real, I mean, obviously Palestinians, face that with, Palestinian history and that. So I think that's a constant struggle that, educators have to, there's an element, I know if people have heard of Rethinking Schools, really great, resource to get connected with. And I think there's real struggles around that to be able to say, how can we get this taught in schools, whether it's current affairs or history, because there's a historical element and then there's an element of this continues to go on. Just like teachers today, progressive teachers have to fight to teach the real history of racism and genocide of this country and the continuing relevance of the Black Lives Matter movement and why, it's important, in the same ways that, ethnic studies and women's studies and were won in universities. They didn't just come about, but they were done through activism by professors and students themselves. That's how a lot of those programs came about in the 1960s. So I think there's a real moment right now to be able to kind of push on that. And I think there's an element of the pedagogy inside of the classroom and kind of a commitment to teaching that history. And there's, and then there's, I think, an element that's more social, which is, I think one of the, for people who are teachers, one of the strongest places and maybe where we're weakest in terms of Palestine activism. So if you're a teacher, no teachers, is the unions. Unions were central to being able to really weaken South African apartheid and took very strong positions that they would not support the South African regime in different ways, whether that's not shipping, armaments or different supplies there, but different forms of essentially supporting that BDS movement. And I think what people are saying about defending the censorship is really important, because we're in the middle of that on the question of Palestine, but on a question of a whole host of issues. There's a real attack on democracy in this country.
Yes.
The sharp end of it in a lot of ways was on Palestine. It kind of set the ground for a lot of, the various attacks. So there's no way, to do it, but to figure out ways to kind of resist against that. And it kind of is actually connected to the question of the Philippine, solidarity, because they're not, there's a reason that Trump was trying to make overtures to the Duterte regime, right? He loves these tough guy authorities.
Oh, yes.
There's a real polarization in the world in which there is a right-wing shift among countries in the Philippines. We see it with Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? There are these right-wing elements that are emerging that are really attempting to erode democracy, and they tend to, agree on the question of Israel, as and Palestine as well. And so I think that connecting the intersectionality and connecting the Palestinian struggle and talking about it within that context, that it's one of the central fights that is actually a fight for democracy. It is a fight for defending our democracy. It's not a coincidence that one of the most racist apartheid regimes is thrilled by Trump's presidency, and is going actually around Latin America and finding the most authoritarian regimes to buddy up with, because they see that as a strengthening of the kind of governance and the kind of inequality and racism that they have at home there. And in that sense, it really is our fight. Think about our military, our police forces actually go and train in Israel. Now, the police in this country don't need any lessons in racism. It's been here for a very long time, but the militarization of it and some of the tactics are actually being generalized because of years of having a captive Palestinian population that's a guinea pig. So anyways, I think what you guys are talking about is actually it's really, because I have no clue about the stuff you're discussing in terms of tactics for how do you move your particular organization forward on this question. And I think that is just some of the most important stuff. The only thing I will say is, just for my long years of this work, is I've never seen a moment in which there's so much openness to Palestine. And I'd love to hear if you guys feel that if that's similar in any way among people in your group.
For me, I have watched the General Synod change, because I've been there now, I think it's 3 times. The first time there was a lot of resistance, like, what are you talking about? Why are we doing this? And the next 2 times, that was not the case. There was a lot more openness and understanding. I think partly because we taught them the first time, but also because the culture is changing. People are hearing it more across the country. And for that, I'm really grateful.
Yes.
So our big issue right now is November 3rd.
Yep.
And the fact that we have to have some major changes in our country so that we can be talking with those that we know will strive to support Palestine and will strive to support democracy and equality, and not be bullying everyone around. And so our communicating what we're learning as facts, because I didn't know what he was sharing. I didn't know the history. To have that kind of information available to send to our political representatives to give them our input of please support this is a major importance, especially as we're going toward a hoped for exchange of building toward a better future.
Mhm.
So Raylene, we have lots and lots of materials that we can get you in touch with if you want to learn more.
Right.
And then to be able to share those.
Where are you, Raylene?
I live in Scotts Mills, Oregon, which is about 40 minutes south of Portland.
Okay. Thank
Okay,
you.
not far.
What
Nope.
do you attend? One of our churches?
Clackamas.
Okay. You've got a great church.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I live in Milwaukee, so I'm sure we can get you some materials to use at your church when you're able to do that, but also to show online. There are lots of movies to show online. This drives me crazy trying to talk with that thing in my ear. Can't tell what I'm doing. So, we can help with that.
So my Facebook page, when I first started using Facebook, I determined that it was, to me, going to be a ministry page. So there's things that when folks ask me what my political standard is, I say WWJD. And sometimes I have to explain that, but that's okay. But I try to post things, whether it's videos or whatever else, and I always post them public, information that I hope will create a need to think will plant a seed. And that's what I'm hoping with the information that you give me. And I know Adam Erickson does the same thing.
Yes.
Very much so. But if I had things that I could add on, because even if I've just got 2 or 3 people that pay attention and decide, oh, I didn't know that, and they share it, who knows where that seed can go.
That's right.
I'd appreciate the information.
Be glad to send you things. I also, why else shall I go ahead and talk about this sheet that I have brought so that that has some of the resources?
Yeah, please do. And I was going to say, the only other thing I was going to say was I dropped a few links in the chat if people want to use them. You might all be familiar. Obviously, it sounds like a lot of you have been doing this work as well for a really long time. I really like the 101 Visualizing Palestine. Some of those graphics are really, really great, and I think get across what's happening in a way. And then I also shared the Rethinking Schools interview with Ziad Abbas about teaching Palestine too, for any educators that you might know who might be interested in figuring out how to, you know, bring in some of that curriculum. And thank you all so much for having me today.
Don't disappear. Stay
Fantastic.
put.
Okay, I won't go anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah,
There
thank
you go,
you.
Catherine.
So I just wanted to speak about these pieces. The Central Pacific Conference Palestine-Israel Network is a branch of the United Church of Christ Palestine-Israel Network. And as I just was speaking about, they create resolutions to take to General Synod. They have helped to sponsor trips there. They've worked to divest from businesses that are in the illegal settlements, demolishing Palestinian homes, and they gather resources. And that is a site right underneath there, a site that you can go to and you can get more resources. We are going to be sponsoring a webinar coming up on the 25th of October. It's called How Are the Children? And it's about the arrest and imprisonment of Palestinian children. And I hope you will attend that, Raylene. That's one to encourage your church to be a part of, to watch that online, and there'll be questions afterwards, before and afterwards. There'll be an introduction and then questions afterwards. But the children are being arrested against international law. And so the ability to get on that will be on the way under the ad, that's our ad, the Central Pacific Palestine Conference, rather, Palestine-Israel Network. And then you go to that and there's a place to register for it. We are working on I can't do all of them, but we are working on a YWCA partnership with Jerusalem. Marcia, who's been on this call, took sewing machines over there as a project, worked with refugee women at the YWCA, teaching how to sew with those machines so that they might earn money down the road. And we're talking about the possibility of helping with a playground as a resistance, since the settlement's encroaching and wants to get rid of areas that are Palestinian land. So we're talking about helping with that playground, COVID-19, health kits, computers, scholarships for children in the refugee camps. I urge you to go online and with this, this next one, which is the co-sponsoring of the Betty McCollum bill, HR 2407. I love that. 2407 is the name of that one, and it's about the arrest and detaining of Palestinian kids. Betty McCollum put that out, for which we're very grateful, and you can co-sponsor. There is a new boycott going on, which is the General Mills and Pillsbury boycott, because of the factory that they have in the West Bank, and we are beginning to look at that as a possibility as a team. I'm doing it personally, but I urge you to go online and look at the materials that they've been putting together. They just recently met with the board of directors there so that they can bring their concerns to them, and they were protesting outside. And I also urge you to call your senators and representatives to try to get them to stop funding Israel. The money that goes to Israel is used for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and for bombs that they bomb Gaza with them. They use them for planes and all kinds of things that are against what we really want to see happening for the people who are Palestinian there. And we want to say to them that there's a whole list of things that you can say to your representatives, the senators and representatives, about the things that Israel's doing that are all against international law. You can go online, and this next one, which is the hatcnow.org, which is the showing of the How Are the Children. You can show it in your own church using the internet access that you have. And then there are a number of films, really good films as well, at the Palestine portal. So that's another place that you can go. And Raylene, that's a spot that you can preview things and decide if you want to show them. These 3 books are just introductory great books that you can use with parishioners and do a study group online. The General Son is by Miko Peled, who is a Jew, and I think it's always helpful to have a Jewish person who kind of breaks the bubble of, oh, you can't talk about this because it'll hurt the Jewish people's feelings. Well, there are many Jews who totally agree with what we are doing and raising as issues. And he is one who is he's a very prophetic man. His niece was killed by a Palestinian, and that whole family has done so much work for the Palestinians once they came to understand why someone would do that. And they're amazing people. Blood Brothers by Elias Shakur it's a great introductory book. It's the first book I read before traveling over there. It was just a terrific story of a man who started a school, but he was a Palestinian man who had lost everything. And the whole story of that family and his life and how he has worked to be a peacemaker there it's a beautiful story. And the Lemon Tree, I know some of you were saying that even in our chat box. It does sound like the Lemon Tree, the story of Wael going back. I'm going to do your last name again, Wael, by mistake here. So that's a wonderful story as well, the Jewish and Palestinian conversation about the home that the Palestinians used to live in. And if you're interested in joining us in our work, the CPC PIN, you can write me at aldercatherine@aol.com. We're doing meetings by Zoom now, which means that we can include people from Idaho, from Washington, from downstate, upstate, all around really. And so you can write me, but please use CPC in the subject line so I know it's from somebody who's interested in this particular topic, or it'll get tossed out with all the other pieces that I get every single day. And that's my phone number. You could call and leave me a message as well. And I promise to get back to you. Whew. So I wanted to say a special thank you to Wael for sharing his bold voice for Palestine. And now you just took my little script away.
Oh.
And for all of you for joining our camp, our knowledge camp. And I don't know if there are other questions for Wael.
Well, are there books that you recommend or organizations that you recommend that people follow on social media?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always recommend to people to read Ilan Pappé, and he's come out with a lot of books, and actually, YouTube videos too. Ilan Pappé is wonderful, very clear on the subject. And in terms of organizations, there's the Adala Project, which is based out of NYC, but really does a lot of work and actually does a lot of stuff on Palestinian children in detention camps. They're on Twitter, they're on social media. Their national director is really wonderful.
Can you put that in the chat box for me so I can see how it's spelled?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, both of them. Both those resources.
Oh, what was the one that I just said? Sorry, it's getting late. Ilan Pappé.
Yeah, those two.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah.
Organization.
And Ilan Pappé's recent book, I haven't gone through it, but I've seen a couple of his presentations and reviews on it. I understand is really fantastic, and it's kind of a way to really understand how to, a really nice way he uses the kind of a prison analogy to understand all the different dimensions of Palestinian oppression. We talk about apartheid a lot, which I think is very useful, but also this prison analogy that he uses in his new book, I think really capture all the different dimensions of what Palestinians face.
Do you watch what Jewish Voice for Peace is putting out and Mondoise?
Yes, absolutely. Jewish Voice for Peace, Mondoise, Electronic Intifada is really great. So, you know, I think there's a lot of different resources, and I could put those in here as well. Were you trying to say something, Nico? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, no, well, I know a lot of people were talking about, you know, within education, you know, why didn't we hear about some of this stuff in school growing up? And, you know, obviously we consider it very important to have kids in our life understand what's going on as well. And I'm putting in the name of a 13-year-old Palestinian journalist, Jannah Jihad.
Oh, yeah.
Who came to Portland recently, and we weren't able to see her live, but we saw her. It's just a really nice way for kids to kind of be able to connect and understand. And she's a brilliant young woman. And I really love her message. And it's just great to be able to say, like, hey, let's put this into more straightforward, simple terms. And for children, you know, there's a lot, it's a hard topic to bring up, but it's really important that, you know, for us, for our family, for children to understand what's going on. So just a really nice resource there as well.
Thank you.
I'll mention one more that Nico had actually turned me on to. I think I read it like 2 years ago. And I think this one's really great, especially for people who've been doing, you know, kind of like engaged with Palestine a long time or are pretty familiar with kind of the ABCs and the basics, but want something a little bit deeper. And it's Mahmoud Darwish's work, his translated work, The Journal of an Ordinary Grief, is just incredible because you kind of read it and it's like half poetry, half story, half just an incredible history and deep understanding from, you know, obviously one of Palestinians, you know, heroes in literature. And you know, I'd spent so many years, you know, talking about Palestine, and just reading that, it was kind of like, you know, it kind of hits you like, oh my God, it's such a fresh, new, you know, deep perspective. So if people like literature, I think you'll just love that. It's like almost a daydream through apartheid, you can call it.
Can you, oh, sorry, got it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and all the links that Wael is putting in here
Oh, thank you,
get
Val.
saved. So
Thank you.
we'll send them back out along with the recording.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Gail, for all your technical expertise.
Yes.
Oh, you're welcome. I was wondering, I was looking on Amazon. Is that book The Biggest Prison on Earth by Ilan Pepe?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
The biggest.
A History of the Occupied Territories. It was last year. Yeah.
Great. Wow. Well, thank you so much, everybody. This has been wonderful. So good to reconnect with
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I can speak. The other thing I always want to say after we do this kind of discussion is it can feel overwhelming and depressing, but don't let that get you. There are many things you can do. The sheet that we're going to send out and all these things that Wael and others are sharing right now, these are things you can share with your churches. And also there are activities that you can do. You're not helpless.
Right.
Terrific.
Don't let yourself get overwhelmed. It's not a good idea to, right now, don't be overwhelmed.
I want to say that I made my own biscuits tonight. I didn't use Pillsbury. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's
There you go.
All right.
That's good.
Excellent. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right.
Yeah, it's a strange moment we're in. It's both a very difficult time and also this amazing moment of radical kind of hope and possibility for transformation. I think Palestine and a whole bunch of issues. Has this element to it.
I have two sons. One's 28 and one's just turning 21. And just seeing the difference in what they learned at school in those 7 years has been remarkable. I'm just affirming what you're saying, that it feels like there's opening, even
There
though
is.
there's this horrible right-wing reactionary menace happening. There's also this great opening, it feels like.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, that whole connection with Black Lives Matter
Yeah.
and Palestine happened when Michael Brown was killed.
Yes.
The
Ferguson.
people of
Yeah.
Palestine were contacting the protesters in St. Louis, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
To tell them what to
Ferguson.
expect, because some of the police had been trained in Palestine, and they
Yeah.
knew, here's how you protect yourself from this tear gas. This is what you can expect from the police. That was pretty amazing. So
Oh.
that the link has been made in a lot of ways, and we just need to build on it.
Yes. Absolutely.
So
All right.
don't give up. Don't
Yeah.
give up.